Some riders spend decades on motorcycles, 20, 30, even 40 years, without a single crash. You are about to see what actually keeps some riders crash-free for decades and why most never even notice it. No close calls, no stories, nothing. And when you watch them, it almost feels underwhelming. They are not fast, not aggressive. Nothing about them looks exceptional, which is where this gets uncomfortable. Because everything most riders believe, skill, reflexes, experience, points somewhere else. But none of that explains decades without incident. If it were visible, you would notice it. You don't. Because the difference happens quietly, long before anything goes wrong. And once you see it, it changes everything. But first, you need to see what the numbers reveal. Step back for a moment and look at the bigger picture. This is not a casual subject. In a single year, more than 6,000 motorcyclists were killed on American roads. That is not just a number. That is thousands of ordinary rides that turned into something final, often in seconds. And it gets worse. Per mile traveled, a rider is roughly 28 times more likely to die than someone in a car. 28 times. If safety came down to skill or quick reactions, those numbers would not look like this. Because most crashes do not give you time. They unfold fast, sometimes before you fully register what is happening. A car turns across your path. Traffic compresses without warning. A corner tightens more than expected. By the time you react, the outcome is already in motion. So when riders say they will handle it in the moment, they are trusting time that does not exist. And here's where it starts to shift. Because there is a group of riders who don't rely on that moment at all. Not because they react faster, but because they've already dealt with the situation long before it becomes visible to everyone else. We will come back to that later on. But first, you need to see why these situations keep happening in the same way over and over again. That is why these numbers keep repeating. Because this is not random chaos, it is structured, predictable. And once you start to recognize that structure, the real question becomes impossible to ignore. Where do these situations actually begin? And if this kind of real-world breakdown is the kind of writing insight you've been missing, drop a quick hype in the comment, because that's what keeps this kind of clarity coming. The kind most riders only understand after it's already too late. So where do riders actually get caught? When crash data is broken down, one pattern rises above everything else. Not racing, not extreme conditions, something far more ordinary. A rider approaches an intersection. Nothing looks unusual. A car waits to turn, then suddenly moves straight across the rider's path. This left turn scenario has shown up for decades, from early studies to modern data. And the driver almost always says the same thing. I didn't see the motorcycle. Not misjudged, not rushed, just unseen. At first that sounds impossible, but it isn't. Motorcycles are small. They blend into the background. A single headlight can distort distance, and most drivers are not actively looking for them. Their attention is tuned for cars, larger shapes, familiar patterns. So even when a motorcycle is visible, it is not truly registered. That is where the failure happens. The rider is there. The driver looks and still pulls out. And this repeats constantly. Different roads, same setup, which means it is not random. It follows a sequence, approach, visibility gap, late recognition, and by the time it becomes obvious, the space to respond is already disappearing. That is the part most riders underestimate. What happens next is limited by something they cannot control. Now look at that same moment again, but slow it down. A rider moves through an intersection. A car begins turning across their path. From the instant that movement registers as danger to the point of impact, there are often 2 to 3 seconds. That's it. And this is exactly where those predictable patterns start to show up in real life. We just talked about how consistent these situations are. So I want to ask you directly. Have you ever had a moment where a car just didn't see you, especially at an intersection? Drop it in the comments, because your experience might help another rider recognize that exact pattern before it turns into something worse. Inside that window, everything has to happen. Your brain has to detect the threat, interpret it, choose a response. Then your body has to act, all under pressure, at speed, with very little room. Here's the part most riders never fully accept. By the time you begin responding, the outcome is already forming. Because reaction is not immediate. Even trained riders have a delay between seeing and doing. That is human, not a flaw. So when someone says they will brake harder or swerve if needed, they are counting on time that usually is not there. That belief creates a false sense of control. In reality, reacting in the moment is a last resort, and last resorts fail more often than people think. This is why two riders can face the same situation and walk away with different outcomes. One is forced into a desperate move. The other never gets trapped there at all, not because they were quicker, but because they positioned themselves earlier. And if reacting in the moment is already too late, then the real question is not about speed, it is about what happened before that moment ever arrived. And that is where the next layer begins to unfold, inside the rider's own decisions and behavior. So if reaction is not what saves you in those final seconds, what puts riders there to begin with? When you dig into crash data, the pattern is hard to ignore. A large share of serious crashes ties back to rider choices. Speed carried a little too far, alcohol in the system, lack of proper training, or no license at all. These are not rare cases. They repeat constantly. And one category stands out: single vehicle crashes, no car pulling out, no outside trigger, just the rider, the road, and a miscalculation. Entering a corner too hot, reading the curve wrong, losing control under braking. There is no one else to point at. And that forces a different perspective. Because risk rarely shows up all at once, it builds quietly, a little extra speed, a skip check, confidence creeping past reality. Individually, they feel harmless. Stacked together, they erase your margin. And that is how riders end up trapped in that tiny window where options disappear. This is where the idea of luck falls apart. If it were random, the same behaviors would not keep producing the same outcomes. But they do, which means this is a system. Decisions shape exposure. Exposure shapes consequence. And the rider sits right in the center of it, not as a victim, but as a variable. And once you accept that, the focus shifts again towards something even more subtle. What actually separates the rider who gets caught off guard from the one who almost never ends up there in the first place? This is where things stop being opinion and start becoming measurable. Researchers didn't just ask riders what they look at, they tracked it. In real traffic on real roads, recording exactly where attention goes second by second. And the gap between riders shows up instantly. It's not throttle control, it's not braking skill, it's not faster hands. It's what their eyes are doing long before anything happens. Newer riders tend to ride inside a narrow tunnel. Their focus stays close, locked onto the strip of asphalt ahead or the car in front. They move with the flow, and when something changes, their attention jumps to it. But at that point, the situation is already unfolding. Now look at riders who rarely get into trouble. Their vision isn't fixed, it's constantly moving. They're reading the road far ahead, scanning across intersections, checking side streets, tracking vehicles that haven't even become a threat yet. It looks calm, almost effortless, but it's anything but passive. They pick up on small shifts most people miss: a front wheel beginning to roll, a driver's head turned the wrong way, a gap that feels just a little too tight. Nothing dramatic, not yet. And that's exactly why it matters. Because when you catch something early, you don't need to panic later. You adjust quietly, roll off a little speed, shift your position, open up space, and the problem fades before it ever becomes urgent. From the outside, it looks like nothing happened. But that nothing is the result of constant, deliberate awareness. They're not reacting to danger, they're dissolving it before it fully forms. And once you recognize that, the whole idea of relying on quick reactions starts to fall apart, which leads to a surprising contradiction, because if this is what actually keeps riders safe, then why do so many experienced riders still miss it completely? But before answering that, let me ask you, what's one habit you've seen, or maybe even had, that you now realize could have gone wrong? Be honest and share it in the comments, because these small patterns scale fast, and your insight could genuinely shift how someone else rides tomorrow. Most riders eventually land on a similar theory. It must be time, more years on the bike, more miles behind them, more exposure to real-world riding. That should equal better judgment, right? But when researchers started digging deeper, the pattern didn't hold. Experience by itself wasn't the deciding factor. In several controlled comparisons, riders with years on the road but no structured training didn't outperform newer riders who had been properly taught. In some cases, they actually lagged behind. That feels counterintuitive, because we tend to treat time as proof of progress. But time does something else too. It reinforces whatever you repeat. If a rider gets away with small mistakes long enough, those mistakes stop feeling like risks. They start feeling like just how riding is. A little too fast into corners, a little too close in traffic. A quiet assumption that other drivers will notice them. Nothing happens until something does. And when it does, those habits are already baked in. Now look at riders who've gone through structured training. They don't just ride, they build a system. They learn where to place their attention, how to. Read situations early, when to adjust before anything looks wrong. But the real shift isn't technical, it's mental. Untrained riders tend to blame outward. Trained riders question inward. That single shift changes everything. Because the moment you take responsibility, you start shaping outcomes instead of reacting to them. So if experience alone cannot guarantee safety, then something deeper must be shaping the way these riders think. And that realization naturally brings us to the next layer of question. What is the real difference in how these riders think? It comes down to a single shift. They don't ride on reaction. They ride on anticipation. On the surface, that sounds almost too simple, but it completely changes how a ride unfolds. Most riders move through traffic waiting for something to happen. A car drifts, a light changes, a situation develops, then they respond. Brake, swerve, correct. It feels active, it feels engaged, but it's still reactive. And as you've already seen, reaction depends on something fragile, time. And when a situation turns critical, time is the first thing to disappear. Now look at riders who almost never end up in those moments. They aren't waiting. They're thinking forward, constantly. Every stretch of road becomes a quiet analysis. What might change? Where could risk appear? If that vehicle moves, what's my exit? They're not guessing outcomes. They're preparing for possibilities. And as those possibilities shift, so do they, subtly. A slight reduction in speed, a repositioning within the lane, a deliberate creation of space. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent. But those small adjustments stack up. They remove the need for sudden action. That's the real objective. Not sharper reflexes, but fewer moments that demand them. And once you see riding this way, control isn't about handling emergencies. It's about preventing them. But a strategy only becomes powerful when it is structured and repeatable, and that is exactly where the next step forward begins, through the frameworks that turn this mindset into a consistent riding routine. So what does this mental strategy actually look like when the bike is moving? This is where it stops being an idea and turns into a system. Riders who stay out of trouble don't rely on instinct alone. They run structured loops in their head, over and over, without pause. One of the most widely taught is simple: search, evaluate, execute. First search, constantly. Not just the lane ahead, but side streets, mirrors, driveways, anything that could develop into movement. Then evaluate. What matters here? Which vehicle is unpredictable? Where could a conflict form? Then execute. A small adjustment. Roll off a little speed. Shift your position. Open space. And then it resets. Immediately. There's a second framework that goes even deeper. Scan, identify, predict, decide, execute. The key difference is prediction. Not just seeing what's present, but projecting what might unfold. You approach an intersection, a car waits to turn. Before it moves, you've already considered the possibility. You ease off, adjust your line, prepare an exit. Nothing happens. But a full decision cycle just completed. That's the power of structure. It turns riding into a continuous process, clear, repeatable, and forward-looking. And once that process becomes natural, the road starts to feel different, more readable, less chaotic, which leads to the next layer: how far ahead you need to see for this to actually work. Most riders judge the road by distance. The safest riders judge it by time, and that shift changes everything. Instead of asking how far they can see, they're asking something far more useful: how long until this becomes a problem? Because distance means nothing without time to respond. So they divide the road into moving time zones. The first is the immediate zone, just a couple seconds ahead. This is where action happens instantly. A brake light flashes, a door swings open, a pedestrian steps out. If something reaches this space unplanned, there's no strategy left, only reaction. Then comes the mid-range window. This is where control still exists. You can ease off the throttle, adjust your lane position, prepare your hands. Smooth riders start making changes here before anything becomes urgent. But the real separation happens further out. Far ahead, well beyond what most riders focus on, is where decisions are actually made. This is where patterns emerge. Intersections take shape. Traffic behavior starts to make sense. Subtle risks begin to reveal themselves early. And when you act here, everything feels calm. Because nothing ever escalates. The situation never compresses into panic. It gets handled quietly, long before it demands attention. And that's why the best riders often look like they're doing almost nothing at all. Once you understand that the real skill is invisible, the question becomes how riders consistently maintain that level of awareness in constantly changing environments. And that naturally pushes us toward the next set of techniques that keep that awareness active at all times. And it is the part most riders miss, because when it's done right, it leaves no trace. We're used to thinking of skill as something you can see: hard braking, sharp swerves, last-second recoveries, moments that look impressive because they happen right at the edge. But the riders who stay out of trouble rarely live in those moments. What they do is quieter. It's what some instructors describe as problems that never fully form, not avoided at the last instant, but dissolved so early they never become urgent. And that's why it looks like nothing. No sudden inputs, no tension, just smooth, uneventful riding. Because the real work already happened earlier in small decisions that never draw attention. A slight change in speed, a subtle shift in position, a choice made before anything felt wrong. By the time they reach the situation, there's nothing left to solve. From the outside, it can look almost passive, but underneath, it's constant awareness. And the moment you realize the real skill is invisible, a different question takes over. How do you hold on to it? Because this isn't something you switch on once and keep forever. It fades quietly, and most riders don't even notice when it's gone. The ones who stay crash-free don't rely on sharper eyes. They rely on a different way of thinking. Everything starts with information, not speed, not positioning, not control, information. Systems like IPSGA make that clear. Every decision flows from what the rider has already seen, understood, and anticipated. Nothing is rushed, nothing is guessed. But here's where it goes deeper. They're not just scanning the road, they're interpreting it in real time. Some riders take this to an extreme. Inside the helmet, there's a constant internal dialogue. Not noise, structure, a vehicle waiting at a side street, a driver's head turned the wrong way, brake lights flickering far ahead. Each detail gets processed, labeled, prioritized. It keeps the mind from drifting, because the real danger isn't missing something obvious. It's seeing everything and thinking about none of it. That's where things start to fall apart. Autopilot doesn't feel dangerous, it feels smooth, effortless, familiar. Your hands are steady, your line is clean, your speed feels right. And meanwhile, your brain has already checked out. This is why riders get caught off guard on roads they've traveled for years. Not because the road changed, but because they stopped questioning it. The crash-free riders never let it get that far. They stay mentally involved, asking quiet questions no one else hears. What's about to change? Who hasn't seen me yet? Where is this situation heading? They're not waiting for problems to appear. They're tracking them while they're still forming. And that constant engagement, that refusal to drift, that's what keeps everything working underneath the surface. Because awareness isn't passive, it's maintained. But even riders who understand all of this still fall into traps that feel completely logical in the moment, and that's where things start to get dangerous in a way most people never question. So far, we've uncovered how crashes follow patterns, why reactions fail, and how behavior quietly shapes outcomes. So pause for a second. What has stood out to you the most so far? Drop it in the comments because different riders notice different parts of this pattern first. And while you're there, hit like and subscribe because we're just getting into the part where this turns into something you can actually apply every time you ride. Now let's step into the system behind it. Even riders who study technique still carry ideas that quietly work against them, not because they're careless, but because those ideas sound right. That's what makes them dangerous. Take the classic, loud pipes save lives. It feels logical. Make more noise, get noticed. But sound doesn't travel where you need it most. It trails behind the bike. The driver about to turn across your path often hears nothing at all. So riders trust volume instead of position and timing. Then there's lay it down. It gets passed around like wisdom. But the moment the tires leave the pavement, control is gone. Braking and steering disappear instantly. What's left is a slide you can't manage. High visibility gear helps, but it doesn't guarantee recognition. Drivers can look straight at you and still misread what they're seeing. Different myths, same pattern. They promise protection at the last second instead of preventing the moment entirely. And that clarity is best understood when you place two riders in the exact same situation, which is exactly where the next comparison begins. Picture this: same road, same intersection, same car waiting to turn across your lane. Two riders roll toward it. The first rider notices the car late. It's there, but it doesn't feel urgent yet. Speed holds. Lane position stays fixed. The brain registers the scene without fully questioning it. Then the car moves. Everything tightens. Brakes get grabbed. The bike stiffens. Now every decision is rushed, squeezed into a moment that's already slipping away. Now run it again. The second rider reads it differently because for them, this didn't start when the car moved. It started long before that. The intersection was already flagged. The car wasn't just seen, it was assessed. Space was adjusted. Speed was trimmed. Options were quietly prepared. So when the car finally turns, nothing spikes. No panic, no scramble. Just a smooth response that was already in motion. From the outside, it looks uneventful, but that's the difference. One rider reacts to a problem. The other never lets it become one. And that shift doesn't come from talent. It comes from one thing that should feel undeniable. Crash prevention isn't just about what you notice. It's about the condition you ride in. Because awareness is fragile, and what breaks it isn't always obvious. Alcohol gets the attention, and for good reason. Even a small amount dulls judgment and slows response. But there are quieter threats that do the same damage without warning. Fatigue is one of them. A tired rider doesn't just feel off. Their perception narrows. Scanning becomes inconsistent. Small delays creep in, just enough to matter when timing is everything. Then there's your mental state. Stress, frustration, distraction. They pull your focus inward. The road fades into the background while your thoughts take over. And here's the uncomfortable part. You don't have to feel impaired for it to affect you. That's why routine rides can be the most deceptive. Familiar roads don't demand attention, they steal it. And once that edge slips, everything else follows. Which raises a different question. What happens when awareness alone isn't enough? If you like this kind of breakdown, hit the like button. Because the final piece we're about to cover ties everything together. Awareness and discipline prevent most problems, but not all. When something slips through, the outcome depends on preparation. Because understanding a technique isn't the same as executing it under pressure. Crash-free riders don't leave that to chance. They train deliberately, braking hard, swerving clean, managing throttle with precision. Not once in a while, but until those actions feel automatic. Because in a real moment, there's no time to think it through. The body reacts based on what it already knows. But here's the shift. They don't treat close calls as proof of skill. They treat them as warnings. If it escalated that far, something was missed earlier. So instead of feeling lucky, they break it down. They trace it back. Then they refine both their thinking and their control. Not just to react better, but to need that reaction less often. And that's where everything starts to come together. At the start, the question seems simple. Why do some riders never crash? Most people point to skill, faster reflexes, better control, more time on the road. But that answer doesn't hold up because crashes aren't decided in the final moment. They're shaped long before it through attention, timing, and choice. The riders who stay upright don't rely on skill to save them. They rely on judgment to avoid needing it. They think earlier, see sooner, adjust quietly. So when the moment arrives, the one that forces others into panic, they're already beyond it. No drama, no recovery, no close call, just a ride that keeps flowing. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. If this changed how you think about riding, the next video takes it even further into real situations most riders never see coming. Tap the next video and keep going. Subscribe to stay with the channel, and like the video if you want more breakdowns like this.